Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Queen archetype as it relates to codependent and narcissistic behaviors. So an archetype is a common figure, symbol, or pattern that can be found across all human cultures across all eras. And as such, it's a form of instinctual human knowledge as the archetypes reside in the collective unconscious. And this isn't just knowledge in the abstract. They're actually parts of ourself that can inform our personality in both positive and negative ways. So if we have the healthy form of an archetype that integrates into our personality, it can help us really tap into hidden potentials and strengths. So for example, somebody who is honing their creative skills may be channeling the artist archetype. Now, in terms of unhealthy patterns, if we have a dysfunctional or disintegrated archetype that integrates with us, we're going to take on some of those same behaviors. And so in this video, it's going to be all about the Queen archetype, and I'm going to talk about the healthy, integrated version of the Queen archetype and the unhealthy, disintegrated version of the Queen archetype. So to understand the Queen archetype, we have to first understand that she's fundamentally a ruler archetype. And as a ruler archetype, that means she's primarily concerned with personal sovereignty. So the King archetype is also concerned with personal sovereignty, but because he is a masculine principled ruler, he's more so focused on the externals of his kingdom, making sure that his kingdom that he rules over is protected from intruders and is able to practice diplomacy with other people. So in life, this translates to people that you don't know very well, and being able to coexist within a huge society where you might know some people and might not know others. Now, the Queen archetype as a feminine principled ruler is more internally focused. So that means that she is focused on the workings within the kingdom. So it's similar to like a queen bee in her hive. So a hive, all of the bees play different roles. So there are workers, there are drones, there are cleaners, and there are a bunch of other roles. And it's the queen's job to make sure that all of them are working together in a way that's functional and that works out for everyone. So someone who has integrated the healthy Queen archetype is somebody who has the capacity for setting personal boundaries, having a sense of personal sovereignty and authority over one's own life, and a sense of self-trust, also combined with the ability for relationship and connection and compassion and empathy with other people. And so that's really the healthy Queen in a nutshell. Now, when a split occurs within an archetype or an aspect of self, what happens is that these two poles will rend apart and polarize even further. And one part of that polarity will jut forward into the personality and really possess the person's identity, where the other part gets pushed away and put into the shadow. So in the case of the Queen archetype, I call this split the Codependent Queen and the Narcissistic Queen. So somebody who is possessed by the Codependent Queen is somebody who can have all of the relationship and empathy and connection, but can't maintain their sense of personal sovereignty and boundaries. Now, the Narcissistic Queen possessed person is somebody who can have that sense of self, can have that sense of authority over their kingdom and their sense of personal boundaries, but doesn't have any capacity for empathy or compassion or working toward the greater good that the Codependent Queen has. Now, as with any schism within an archetype or an aspect of the self, there can be varying degrees of split. People can have a milder form of the split, and people can have a more extreme form of this split. And what I've noticed in particular with this archetype, the Queen archetype, that I have not really met anybody who has a perfectly integrated form of this split. So chances are there's some degree or another of split going on, and you only really get into the extremes the further you tear those two poles asunder. So a lot of times codependency and narcissism gets talked about as though it's only in the form of the most extreme. Only people with dependent personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. But there's a whole spectrum up here of disintegration that, most everybody that I've ever met has. And the same could be said of all schisms of opposites, where there's that polarization possession repression dynamic that goes on. But the Queen archetype in particular is one that people struggle with, and I believe that's because the concept of feminine rulership hasn't really been around for most, if not all, of written history. And that's because even queens and empresses and people like that, weren't quite really embodying the Queen archetype. They were more so an extension of the King archetype because of the era and humanity that we were in. And so I think that in this current era that it's really important for every man and woman to really be able to integrate their Queen archetype in a healthy way so that we know how to exist in relationship while also maintaining our own boundaries. So to give a more comprehensive description of the Codependent Queen, we have somebody who is primarily concerned with being liked by her subjects, and as such she gives away all of her own power. She's somebody who gives her throne away to anybody who comes along because she fundamentally has doubt in her own competence and her own ability to maintain personal sovereignty. She has no awareness of her boundaries, and so she naturally lets people over her boundaries because her boundaries, instead of being like hard lines, are like blurry lines that she's scarcely aware of. And while she has the capacity for high levels of compassion toward her subjects or toward other people in her social group, she has no ability for self-compassion and respecting her own boundaries. The Narcissistic Queen, on the other hand, her primary concern is herself. She is all about self-aggrandizement. She loves rulership for rulership's sake. She basically, she will be the expert on every single thing that she ever does, even if she knows nothing about it. So she's really full of hot air. And she always has this front of this power coming into the situation. And she very much believes that she is above her subjects. And she rules with an iron fist. She's also deeply manipulative. So she's manipulative in the sense that she is more than willing to pit certain groups against one another if it benefits her personally or if it's, just amuses her. Ultimately, she is the type of person to stir up drama just for fun. Now, in terms of the manipulation of the Narcissistic Queen, the Codependent Queen also does a form of more covert manipulation. But again, the manipulation is all about being liked. The Narcissistic Queen doesn't care about relationship or being liked or, having empathy for others at all. It's really about what can I gain from this? It's the me show. And in terms of how the Narcissistic Queen deals with the weak, she either exploits them for her own gain or throws them in the garbage, exiles them. In terms of strong people, she really doesn't like strong people because she knows that deep underneath there's a lot of insecurities and she really is full of hot air. So anyone that challenges her is an extreme threat and she will behave toward them in that way. And so, of course, with both of these polarized aspects of the Queen archetype, you're going to have an incredibly dysfunctional kingdom. So in the Codependent Queen's kingdom, nobody's going to be able to get what they need because the Codependent Queen is ineffectual at conflict and is unable to see past her need for being liked to make the tough decisions that running a kingdom calls for. The Narcissistic Queen, on the other hand, is basically going to run her kingdom into the ground because she just enjoys manipulating people so much, and it's really about her being number one, and it's this constant competition that she's in within her kingdom. And so that translates to life in terms of one situation where in a social circle, someone possessed by the Codependent Queen is constantly having their boundaries gone over, and there's no real ability for relationship that can exist there, because it becomes this exploitative situation coming in toward the person possessed by the Codependent Queen. Someone possessed by the Narcissistic Queen, on the other hand, will be the one going over other people's boundaries and will destroy all of their relationships in that way. Now, in terms of the relationship between the Codependent Queen and the Narcissistic Queen, you have to realize that there are two forces that are happening between those poles. So if we can think internally that there is a literal Codependent Queen and a literal Narcissistic Queen that are kind of battling it out on the inside as individual selves, as personalities, the Codependent Queen really doesn't like the Narcissistic Queen because the Codependent Queen thinks the Narcissistic Queen is evil. The narcissistic queen, on the other hand, really doesn't like the codependent queen because she thinks the codependent queen is weak. And so it's their greatest fear to seem like one another, and that's the reason for that internal schism. So there's this great force of separation keeping them apart, usually as a result of some trauma that happened earlier on in life or some way of indoctrination that caused the person to demonize one side of that split. Now, in contrast to that disintegration force, that separating force, there's also an integrative force, and that's the force of entropy, because all archetypes are always moving toward wholeness. All aspects of self are always moving back toward wholeness. So if there's nothing obstructing the way, those two parts naturally fall back into integration with one another. And the way that these two polar forces work is that the codependent and narcissist possessed queens tend to both attract one another and are deeply repulsed by one another at the same time, which spells disaster, of course, in relationships, but there's also a lot of internal conflict happening within the inner sphere. So that which is going on within is going on within, out. So as within, so without. Now, in terms of the internal relationship of somebody who is possessed by the codependent queen and has the narcissistic queen in the shadow, this person will basically go about their life. They won't be able to set boundaries, and they'll have this like low self-esteem kind of thing going on. And the narcissistic queen from in the shadow will start giving it a lot of negative self-talk and criticism. So the person would never express that to other people, but they're just fine with beating up on themselves. And there's like this negative self-talk and constant criticism coming from the repressed narcissistic queen. It can also come out in the form of passive aggressiveness. If the person is not aware that they're actually covertly attacking other people, there'll be like these little jabs and backhanded comments that will come out of somebody who is otherwise codependent. And of course, this further breaks down the boundaries and self-esteem of the person who is possessed by the codependent queen and who has repressed their narcissistic queen. And the repression usually comes from this hyper-identification with a kind of goodness or martyrdom. They don't want the narcissistic queen there because they see that queen as the evil queen and they see themselves as the good queen. Now, this is a lot of the reason why I actually disagree with how a lot of other YouTubers handle the concept of codependency and narcissism, because it's all targeted toward codependence and it feeds into their delusion that they're the good queen and the other person is the bad queen. And in a sense, you know, the narcissistic queen obviously does create a lot more external damage, so it's important to set boundaries. But at the same time, it feeds into the delusion that creates that split, which the codependent queen says, oh, I'm the good one, that's the evil one, I need to push that part away from me. But it's the very pushing the narcissistic queen away from you that actually creates the loss of touch with the ability to have personal sovereignty and boundaries, which is the very thing that will make it to where you stop attracting narcissists in the external. Now, as for someone possessed by the narcissistic queen, you know, and again, there can be all kinds of levels of this split, so don't think that, oh, I'm definitely not a narcissist. You can have some aspect of this split, so it's very important to really tune in for this part. And again, not fall into that trap of thinking narcissistic queen is evil queen, codependent queen is good queen. So someone possessed by the narcissistic queen internally has this codependent queen hanging out in the shadow. And that codependent queen, it registers to the narcissistic queen as this weakness. And this weakness that has to be protected at all costs because there can't be any kind of vulnerability. So it's this internal judgment from their conscious element of self, just like the codependent queen has the narcissist kind of in the back of their head. But the narcissist that comes forward really dislikes what they see internally because they see it as weak, and they put on this front to protect that weakness. They're like a growling dog hiding a wounded leg. And because of this, they put on this show of aggression and self-aggrandizement to keep people away. And this is why people who have strength and who have boundaries are really, really intimidated intimidating for somebody who is possessed by the Narcissistic Queen, because they're afraid of being seen through. They're afraid of having that weakness of the Codependent Queen that's been repressed shown. Now that gives you a good idea in terms of how these two poles of this archetype really resist against one another. They really dislike each other a lot, and they push apart from one another because there's a hyper-identification with goodness in the case of the Codependent Queen, and a hyper-identification with strength in the form of the Narcissistic Queen. And they see each other as antithetical to their ability to either, on the Narcissistic Queen's part, be strong and not weak, and on the Codependent Queen's part, to be good and not bad. Now, since this is what's playing out internally, of course, as within, so without. So it's playing out externally as well. So we have codependent people who have more of a codependent lean, and people with a more narcissistic lean are deeply attracted to one another on an intuitive level. No scheming going on here. It's just like it's like the north side of a magnet, the south side of a magnet, and they just come together because there's that motivation to make that archetype whole. You know, and it's being expressed instead of internally in terms of integrating it on the internal. There's a desire to integrate it on the external. So we have codependents deeply attracted to narcissists, narcissists deeply attracted to codependents, but there's also a repulsion there. And so this type of dynamic is going to be very evident in the relationship dynamic. And again, it's in varying degrees. So someone can have this level of the split and this level of the split. So the further that split is internally, the further your split is going to be in your relationships. Which again is why I gave that caution earlier about why it's important not to demonize narcissists if you are more in the codependent side of the split, because what it does is it pushes that polarity further apart. It tears it further asunder. It makes you more attracted to narcissists, and probably more extreme narcissists at that. So with this, it's very important to realize that the Codependent Queen and the Narcissistic Queen are both sides to the same coin. They're one thing. And if you want to have a healthy form of the archetype, you have to have the healthy parts of both of those poles coming together. So the personal sovereignty of the Narcissistic Queen and the compassion and connection that's possible with the Codependent Queen. Alright, so in terms of how to integrate this archetype, you have to first realize that that polarization first existed for a very positive reason. So basically, in order to cope through a very hard situation, you know, and to make things emotionally safe, one pole or the other had to be repressed. So basically, let's take an example of somebody possessed more by the Narcissistic Queen than by the Codependent Queen. So this person maybe had a parent or parents that were bullies, and the only thing they ever saw was that you're either the bully or the victim. And so it was their goal in life to make sure that they out-bully their bullies. You know, they want to make sure that they're number one all the time so that they can never be put down in that victim status. So when they see codependent queens, they see that person as a victim, and they go, oh no, I'm not living through that again. I'm going to be number one, and anybody who is underneath me, I'm going to treat them exactly the same way my caregivers treated me. There can be other ways that this split comes about, but this is one I see most often. Now, in terms of the codependent side of the split, we can have a person who, you know, grew up around people that, you know, basically didn't allow them to stand up for themselves. You know, basically every time they stood up for themselves, it just made the situation worse. And they got along a lot better when they could just swallow their own truth. And they get used to sort of walking this invisible obstacle course for other people, so they become hyper attuned to what other people expect from them and want from them. And deep down there's this notion that they exist to please others because that's the way they were treated in childhood. And so the narcissistic aspect of the Queen archetype was actually quite dangerous to them because it got in the way of their ability to get along and connect with their family. Because if they showed any sense of having boundaries, any sense of being able to stand up for themselves, they would usually get yelled at or ignored or have love withdrawn. Now again, there can be a litany of different reasons why these repressions might come about, and so it's going to be unique for you as to why there was a split and to what degree of split you have within this archetype. But so it's really important to realize which side of that split you're on. And that's really the first step. You have to first realize which side of the split is possessing your personality and which side of the split is being pushed down into the shadow. And then from there, you really want to figure out why it is that this split happened and why that part was so dangerous to your well-being. And you can do this through the process of active imagination, where you can directly speak from that lens. So you can speak from the aspect of you that is either the narcissistic queen or the codependent queen that's been pushed into the shadow. And because of that, basically, you can actually find answers that you would otherwise not have access to. So you want to think about these shadow aspects as being like their own individual personality that's also very much you, but they're their own self. So they're going to have their own perspective, their own wisdom, their own memories. And if you take on the perspective, or if you ask that part within active imagination as to why it was pushed down to the shadow, you'd be surprised at what kind of answers you get. And so overall, I recommend being able to go back and forth between the codependent queen aspect of the split and the narcissistic queen aspect of the split, and engage them in active imagination. Ask them questions, have like a shower conversation with them. And if you're interested in doing the process of active imagination, I actually have a video on the topic called Active Imagination for Shadow Work. And if I can, I'll link it up here. All right, the next step, once you've engaged those two parts in conversation, in active imagination, what you do is you find out what each part needs in order to be integrated. There's a reason why the disintegration happened in the first place, so you want to figure out what is it that that aspect needs to feel safe coming to the surface of consciousness, or letting go of its possession over the identity. Chances are it's a situation where they need to feel safe in some way. They need to feel like, the purpose for the disintegration is now gone, and so their role as that is now obsolete. And once you understand really what both of those parts need to be able to reintegrate with one another and to feel safe in doing that reintegration, what you do is you then go in and you try to resolve the traumas that created the rift in the first place. So you can do this through body work, because trauma basically resides in the body primarily. And so I recommend looking into my video on how to heal from trauma. The idea is that you basically deal with your trauma on the level of the body, are able to release that, and those emotions that created that rift between those two aspects of yourself dissipates. And in doing so, those parts just naturally fall back into integration with one another. All right, and the last thing that you can do is you can practice orienting to the world from both of those perspectives. What that does is it brings more of those aspects to the surface of consciousness. So if somebody has a repressed narcissistic queen aspect, you want to get used to exercising her positive elements of personal sovereignty and boundaries. And you want to have an intuitive knowing of like what the body postures of that aspect of self would be, and just how physically that person would move through their space. And you'll find that there's a huge physical practice element to being able to integrate these archetypes. And so you want to really be able to have a full range of motion, so to speak, in terms of expressing from either one. And to be able to choose, okay, it's more appropriate in this situation to go with the healthy traits of the codependent queen. It's more appropriate in these kind of situations to go with the healthy traits of the narcissistic queen. And ultimately, you want to make it to where you can actually do both at once. So you don't necessarily have to oscillate back and forth of those two things. You can have compassion, you can have empathy, and you can also have personal sovereignty and boundaries at the same time. So this going back and forth is just a way to work those two elements more and more into integration and get you used to embodying the healthy queen archetype. Anyway, that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button down below and subscribe. Now, if you feel like you might have some personal splits within certain archetypes or within certain aspects of yourself, I highly recommend my Shadow Work Tarot. Basically, it's either a 12-card spread or a 17-card spread, and we go into what's the primary shadow aspect, what does it need, why was it repressed, and what are the next steps to take in terms of like what's going to help toward the integration process. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to leave a link down below in the description box. And if you have any questions, you can email me at thediamondnetchannel@gmail.com. You can also look on my website, thediamondnet.org, for more information. Anyway, that's all I have for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.